Ever feel sluggish, achy, or just off? Without a clear reason? It might be chronic inflammation silently attacking your body. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies that help us live longer, healthier, and more purposeful lives. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In this episode, we consider something that affects nearly everyone, often without them knowing it: inflammation. We'll explain what it is, why it becomes dangerous, and how we can start fighting it, not just with medicine, but with what's in our kitchen. The Aging Well podcast encourages informed decision-making, and always consult your physician and scientific literature when making decisions about your health.
Dr. Armstrong, let's start simple. What is inflammation, and why does our body even use it?
Well, inflammation is our body's built-in defense system. So, you cut your finger or you catch a virus, your immune system's going to send blood, immune cells, and certain chemicals to fix the problem. And that's what we label as acute accumulation. And so in that case, acute accumulation or inflammation is going to be certainly helpful. It's temporary, so it's providing all the essentials for healing. And, it does its job and then it clears out. And so, basic inflammation is a positive. We need inflammation in order to keep the body healthy and healed.
Okay, so when does it become a problem?
Well, if you think of acute accumulation like the fire alarm, it turns off after the fire is out. It turns on, initiates getting that fire put out, and then it turns off. Whereas chronic inflammation is like that alarm just keeps ringing and ringing and ringing, even when there's no emergency. And so that constant low-grade immune activity actually begins to damage normal, healthy tissues and organs.
I think Dr. Farrow talks about this when we interviewed him a few episodes back a couple years ago. Didn't he talk about that alarm ringing with the inflammation?
Yeah, I think we've had several guests, maybe not using that exact analogy, but as we look at, just the chronic state of stress on the body and, looking at cortisol levels, cortisol levels are kind of that fire alarm. When there's stress, cortisol is released in order to help regulate our blood glucose levels, regulate our system in response to that stress. And we see a certain, cycling of cortisol throughout the day. But when we're under this constant stress, that alarm is going off, then our cortisol levels will stay elevated, and, they start to basically, catabolize tissue and do destructive things. We're also kind of sending that alarm to the, neutrophils and the phagocytes and all these immune system cells that are circulating, and, they're all charged up, and, you don't give them something to fight, they're going to start fighting normal tissue. And so this whole idea of the alarm going off is just really damaging to the overall functioning of our bodies.
Yeah, but a lot of people don't walk around thinking, oh, I'm inflamed. And I don't know anyone that recognizes that. So what does it show up as?
Well, I think probably some of us are a little bit more attuned to inflammation than maybe others. I don't think everybody walks around totally in the dark with it. But, if we're not really fully aware of it, or oftentimes we think of, it's all part of aging. We've talked about this on the podcast before, where, people are walking around and they feel things and it's like, well, you're just getting older. Well, we're not supposed to feel that way. And so It often shows up as joint pain, stiffness, fatigue, brain fog. For many people, it's digestive issues. Maybe you're getting frequent colds. Maybe sometimes it's just, I'm not feeling right. I'm just feeling off a little bit. And so over time, this chronic inflammation contributes to very serious health issues like heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, Alzheimer's disease, all forms of dementia, and even cancer.
Yeah. Now, I know a lot of people dealing with a ton of those symptoms that you just described, but why does it feel like everyone's dealing with this now?
Well, I think we touched on this a little bit with the kind of chronic stress. We're always under stress. We're always pulling out these stupid devices here and, scrolling through, and we're looking at the news. I mean, good grief, you just listen to 5 minutes of the news, your stress level is going to go up.
Yeah.
And so not only are we kind of in this environment of chronic stress, but we're sitting all day. Many of us work at our computers, and I'm as guilty as this. I mean, processing and producing these episodes take time on my butt. Teaching, driving, doing all these things. I'm sitting a lot more now than I've ever sat in the past. And, modern life is overall inflammatory. We're eating ultra-processed foods. We're eating more sugar if we're eating those processed foods. We're not sleeping well enough. We don't follow our fourth pillar or fifth pillar of, sleep hygiene. Again, we're under chronic stress. There's tons of environmental toxins. All of these things are affecting our body. And so our bodies are, they're evolved for short bursts of stress. Something happened, you have a threat in the environment. You think of our ancestors, out in more primitive environments where, they hear the roar of a bear in the woods. They gotta, the fight or flight response kicks in to prepare them to either fight or to flight. But now we're in this constant fight or flight state, and we have this non-stop stimulation. And then you couple that with poor nutrition, our bodies are just getting a constant burst of stressors that are leading to inflammation.
I mean, they say we have anti-inflammatory drugs. Aren't those enough?
Well, this is modern medicine. We treat symptoms. We don't really look at the underlying cause. And so, if you have this chronic inflammation, you can treat it with NSAIDs and other drugs and things like that, but you're only treating the symptom. You're putting a Band-Aid, and sometimes you're putting a Band-Aid on something that's not really injured and not looking at the underlying cause. So these drugs can help support and be helpful in the short term. But if you don't change what's driving the inflammation, especially in regards to diet, then all you're doing is kind of turning down the volume of that alarm. You're muting the alarm and you're not putting out the fire.
Yeah, man, I love it. Let's do it. Let's take down Big Pharma right now. Because honestly, what you just said, that's a big claim. Food over pills.
Well, food is information. Every bite that we eat is telling our body something. It's telling us to heal or it's telling us to inflame. The kitchen is where chronic inflammation is either fed or it's starved.
So how do we fight back?
Well, the chances are the answer to the problem is probably already in your pantry, or at least it's in the grocery store. So buying foods that are going to support, turning off that fire alarm, eating more anti-inflammatory types of foods and having a more anti-inflammatory diet, as well as, again, changing a lifestyle. If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
Before this episode, before we hit record, we were actually talking about how my wife and I made some homemade ginger shots, and we made some fresh ginger, some lemon and cinnamon and turmeric. And honestly, turmeric, you just do one search on the internet, everyone hears about turmeric these days. What do you think makes turmeric such a superfood?
Well, Turmeric contains curcumin, one of the most powerful natural anti-inflammatory compounds known to man. It blocks the inflammatory pathways in the body. You mentioned ginger. Ginger works similarly. It also reduces the inflammatory chemicals and helps to support digestion. So the two of them coupled are really nature's natural anti-inflammatory drugs.
Oh, that's kudos to us for making those shots. So let me ask you this. How should people actually use turmeric and ginger? Supplements, or should they just go out and buy the raw food itself?
Well, I think both work, but food is really the great start. We remember our supplement is something that is to supplement our daily intake. And so if we're getting things in our food, then we don't need to be supplementing it with things in pills or in pill form. And so, turmeric, you could take turmeric as a supplement in a capsule form, but it's meant to be in food. It's great to add turmeric to soups, to eggs, rice, even smoothies. But one thing to always consider is you always want to add a little bit of black pepper to help boost the absorption. I think it's about a 1/50th ratio or something like that. But just a small little sprinkle of black pepper is going to help with the effectiveness of that turmeric. So if you're cooking soups and putting it on eggs and things like that, and just add a little pepper into it as well. You can mix it in with a lot of other things. It has some good flavor to it. The one caution I have as somebody who uses turmeric a lot is, be careful getting it on yourself because it does, it's a very, very, it can almost be used like a dye. It's such a bright color and, it doesn't permanently stain, but it can kind of leave marks on you throughout the day. And so you want to be a little bit more aware of that. And I also learned that, I put turmeric in my coffee in the morning. And if I'm not careful and I dribble a little bit of that coffee, it can leave some pretty prominent stains. And I think where that stain comes in is if I use coconut oil in the mix as well, that makes it a more permanent stain. I got some really bright yellow stains on my bedroom carpet that my daughter and my wife have kind of complained to me about. But, you just be a little bit more careful with it. And you don't have to worry about getting the stains all over things. But, you can also use fresh ginger in teas, stir fries, smoothies. The only place I really like ginger is in stir fry. And even then, I'm not a huge fan of ginger. But that's more of a personal preference. I know there's a lot of great teas that have it. I've never tried it in a smoothie, but like you mentioned, you can put it in, daily shots. And, maybe we include that recipe in the description notes. But there's a lot of ways that we can use it in our food as opposed to having to worry about putting it into a tablet form.
Hey, speaking of smoothies, something else that people put in smoothies, spinach, kale, arugula. Now, why are these anti-inflammatory? And what about leafy greens, and why do they even matter?
Well, leafy greens are loaded with antioxidants, magnesium, vitamin K, polyphenols, all these things that help to calm inflammation. And they can also support gut health, which is another major driver of immune balance. And so, they're great in smoothies or just eating, salads and all those types of things. I regularly put spinach in my smoothies every day when I mix up my whey protein. Arugula and kale, I'm a little less inclined to because they're a bit more bitter. But I do like eating arugula in salads and so much.
I'm just going to kind of go off topic just a little bit, but what's your opinion with some of the, I guess you could call it clickbait social media trends where they're saying, kale is bogus and don't eat leafy greens. And I can understand with some of the literature out there that some people, that's the key word, some people can't break it down. They just they're trying to eat healthier, they're trying to make that lifestyle change, but from again the research, there is a lot of other people that can break it down. So real quick, I know you're not an expert on that, but what's your opinion on when you hear the social media trends of saying like, hey, stay away from kale, stay away from spinach? It's absorbing the pesticides, and it produces its own natural pesticides, and it creates a reaction inside your body. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I think most of that's BS. When you really look at it, I've not heard of it creating its own pesticides. Part of the reason we eat spinach, kale, and leafy greens is because it doesn't break down in our bodies. It's called fiber. And fiber doesn't digest, but it helps with our digestive resources. And so eating more leafy greens is just naturally going to help with our digestive tract. And if you find that you have a difficulty with any food, then the smart thing is don't eat that food. Find an alternative to it. And with regards to the pesticides, I got an easy answer for that one. I can answer that in 2 words. Eat organic. If you're worried about pesticides, eat organic. Rather than avoiding a food because there might be pesticides on it, avoid that food with pesticides on it. Don't avoid the food, avoid the pesticides. And the best way to avoid any kind of pesticides is to eat more, natural, organically grown foods as opposed to stuff that's just mass produced from these, big corporate farms that are, spraying everything and anything on the plants to keep them alive and keep them looking greener longer in the grocery store.
Grow your own would also be another option, right?
That's another option too, but not everybody has that opportunity. But, totally. Bringing that up from the standpoint of growing our own, even if you live in an urban environment, you can grow spinach, kale, and those types of things on your own in a small little box garden. It could be on your balcony of your apartment, or get together as a community and, form these small little gardens on open plots in the neighborhood where you can grow your own and you don't have to spray pesticides on any of that. You can keep everything as natural as possible.
Cool. Thanks, Dr. Armstrong. Appreciate that. So how much leafy greens do people really need?
Well, I would say aim for at least 1 big handful at 2 meals a day. So getting a couple handfuls throughout the day, and that's easy to do. You have a little small salad, put it in a smoothie. You can saute greens. Spinach, you saute spinach. You go from, you can put a pound in a skillet and it like shrinks down to about like a tablespoon, it seems.
Right.
Spinach shrinks up so much. And so you can just kind of throw that in your eggs. You can throw it in other foods. I remember when we had Jeremy Rocksmith on nutrition. Well, he was a chef. We had one early last season. He loves throwing kale in just about anything. You throw kale in a soup. It's just an additional ingredient. It doesn't add or distract from the flavor, and it adds nutrients that your body really needs. You can put, spinach, green leafy vegetables in a spaghetti sauce, in almost any kind of soup. I mean, so, be creative. Find your ways. If you don't like eating salads, then don't eat salads, but find ways that you can just throw a fistful of spinach or kale or arugula or something like that into other foods. And very quickly, you've built up, the number of servings that you're getting of those green leafy vegetables.
Yeah, even you mentioned smoothies, like just a handful of spinach into a smoothie. You literally can't even taste it. There's no flavor profile difference, and you're getting those leafy greens in the easiest way possible.
And I would also add, when you do put it in your smoothie, remember, as the representative from Berkeley Life taught us in a recent episode, you want to chew your smoothie. And so we don't want to drink that smoothie down really fast. We want to allow for those greens that we put into it to spend some time in our mouth, because they trigger the release of nitric oxide and other important, chemicals in our body that are going to help, with managing that chronic inflammation that we have as well.
Cool pro tip. Hey, one thing, again, speaking of smoothies, one thing that we are super blessed to have in the Pacific Northwest is berries and cherries. Now, I got to ask you, because these are really, really sweet. So how the heck are they so anti-inflammatory?
And I think everywhere in the country, and probably almost globally, you have berries. Berries are so easily accessible, and it's a pretty easy thing. Find them wild, grow them in your yard, do all those types of things, or even just buy them at a local farmer's market or the grocery store. But they are really rich in anthocyanins, very mouthful thing to say, anthocyanins. These are very powerful antioxidants that reduce inflammation in joints, blood vessels, and the brain. And so getting berries, we're getting something that is a natural antioxidant on a regular basis. And tart cherries in particular help with muscle recovery and sleep.
How often should people be eating berries or cherries? Daily, weekly, monthly, seasonally, when they're, in season during summertime? When?
Well, I mean, certainly seasonally, we should be ramping up how much we eat. But again, you have berries are going to be seasonal themselves. So you get the berries that are in season and eat those, but ideally eat them daily. You can eat a half a cup of berries a day is pretty easy to accomplish. I mean, even just a half cup in your smoothie is super, super easy to do. But it's a very powerful antioxidant habit, and they can be fresh or frozen. Another way that we can, take advantage of the seasonality of berries is, you get them fresh when you can, but you freeze some of them, or you buy them flash frozen, at the grocery store, and you got them all the time. And, I say ideally daily. I would eat them as often as you can. How often can you incorporate these into, the number of meals that you eat a day? You can have them at breakfast. You can have them at lunch. You can have them at dinner. You can have them as a dessert, as a snack. I mean, you should be going for berries as opposed to a lot of the other junk processed foods that we eat.
Real quick, what's your favorite berry?
I don't know if I have a favorite. I mean, we had this discussion in the house going in terms of favorites in general. Like we were talking last night about, favorite books or favorite movies and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it comes down to genres and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, so when it comes to favorite berries, it's probably more seasonal. I mean, I love blueberries. Those are probably one of the easiest ones for me to just have frozen blueberries, throw those into a smoothie on a daily basis, or mix it into my skyr as I make that for work. Blueberries are good. I love raspberries. I mean, we're in Oregon where Marion berries are popular. Well, Marion berries, raspberries, strawberries. I can start getting like Forrest Gump. It's like raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, boysenberries. I mean, go on and on and on. There are so many berries, and I think that's the beauty of berries. There's so many varieties that you don't have to eat the same thing all the time. You can mix those berries. Mixed berries are probably my favorite berry.
Yeah. Mine, huckleberry. We went camping this summer, and we went on a hiking trail, and the entire trail had different varieties of huckleberries, from the black huckleberries to the red huckleberries. And it was, oh my gosh, it was just awesome. You're just picking them as you're going, and it was great. And then probably springtime, I got into thimbleberries. Those are amazing. And I don't know if you've had the luxury of trying those, but I found a little tiny secret hiking trail out in the Pacific Northwest, and right along the creek they have thimbleberries growing. I'll have to pick some and give them to you because they are so amazing. They're so good.
I'm not sure I've ever had them, but
They're like a miniature, almost like a raspberry, but they're shaped like a thimble, and they're almost like a little yarmulke that can fit on your fingers. They're they're so flavorful. They're awesome. Moving on to fatty fish and flax seeds.
let's pause for a moment to thank the affiliate partners who help support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored and no company pays for airtime here. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us keep producing thoughtful, evidence-informed content. One brand I genuinely trust is Aura Wellness, especially their Glutarol, Glutarol Plus, and copper peptide formulations. I've spent time vetting their science, their ingredient quality, and their transparency, and I personally use these products in my own wellness routine. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and exploring tools that may help you feel and function better, check out Aura Wellness in the show notes.
What's the big deal with omega-3s?
Well, omega-3 fatty acids, and we did a recent episode, I think, when we talked about omega-3 and versus omega-6. But omega-3 fatty acids actively turn down inflammatory signals in the body. So they're very protective of the heart, brain, joints, and the gut. And you can find them in so many different foods. You can find them in salmon, sardines, mackerel, flaxseed, chia seeds. The key is, you want to be focused more on the omega-3s as opposed to the omega-6s. You want that proper balance between the two. Our body essentially needs both, but we really need omega-3s more than we need omega-6s. And when we have a little bit higher skewing toward the omega-3s is where we start seeing less risk of heart disease and, cognitive disorders and those types of things. So really important that we get those in our diet as well.
You know what I just realized? What's really actually, and some of our listeners are going to get heartbroken. It's actually really high in omega-6 is avocados. So maybe people need to not have avocado toast and focus on some cans of sardines instead.
Again, it all comes down to balance, and, what do you eat with those foods that kind of counter where there might be an imbalance. And, no one food is going to be the perfect food. That's why I think we've evolved to eat, creative dishes, but keeping things raw, keeping things whole is where we're going to get the best quality of those particular nutrients that our bodies need and get them in the right balance. So we want things from a whole food as opposed to from a supplement form.
So if someone changes nothing but food, can inflammation really improve?
Absolutely. Within weeks, people will often notice less pain, better energy, clearer thinking, certainly better digestion. Food isn't just fuel. We have to think of food as medicine, and it's medicine that we take 3 times a day or more.
What's your thoughts on fasting? Because some would argue that fasting is also a great way to prevent inflammation.
Well, you think about it. Fasting is just not eating food. So it still comes down to food, right? And so fasting, whether you're doing a circadian intermittent fast, which we recommend over just more traditional intermittent fasting, or you're doing a 1 day, 2 day, 3 day water fast, all of those are great things to give our bodies kind of a reset and help promote autophagy and to tune down that inflammation a little bit more. It's kind of like a periodic recheck of that fire alarm, to use that analogy again, just turning down, the alarm so that, our bodies are able to adjust and maybe fight that fire a little bit more effectively. We're putting all of our energy into fighting the fire as opposed to, fighting the fuel that it keeps getting thrown on the fire. If you're fasting, you're not eating pro-inflammatory foods. You're allowing your body naturally to kind of reset itself and take care of whatever inflammation it might be fighting.
Right. Well, speaking of inflammation, we just talked about anti-inflammatory foods, but I feel like you can't discuss the subject of inflammation without talking about pro-inflammatory foods. So, what about pro-inflammatory foods? What should we be avoiding?
That's a great question, because knowing what drives inflammation is just as important as what fights it. And, these don't cause instant damage. They're usually, if they're part of our regular diet, they just kind of tend to keep our body in this constant low-grade inflammatory state. And so the biggest things we want to avoid are ultra-processed foods that are high in refined carbohydrates. They have a lot of added sugar, processed meats. Processed meats have a lot of potential carcinogens in them that can drive inflammation, for our body. Our body's constantly having to defend against the inflammation that those processed foods are causing. We have hear a lot of fuss about industrial oils, trans fats lately, alcohol. Those are things that we should avoid, either entirely or at least reduce those to a certain effect. And so, we want to avoid these foods as much as we can. For some people, it may be daily that we should not have any of those particular pro-inflammatory types of foods. But kind of a good rule of thumb is if it comes in a box, has more than 5 to 7 ingredients that you can't pronounce, or was designed to last a year or more on the shelf, it's probably something that's going to push inflammation up. And there's just tons and tons of foods that are kind of in that pro-inflammatory realm.
Why do deli meats have such a high carcinogen level? Is it like through the preservative process where they're like, you know what? You know how we can preserve this meat? We're going to add cancer-causing substance to it. Like what's the logic behind that? Or does the meat just produce it when they're adding salt to preserve it? Why is that?
Well, it's not the salts per se that are really the issue when it comes to processed meats, because, historically, before modern refrigeration, foods were heavily salted in order to preserve those. And that wasn't necessarily causing the damage that more modern processed meats are. But when I think of processed meats, I think of bacon, sausage, hot dogs, brats, deli meats, sometimes smoked meats, cured meats. These are potentially carcinogenic because they contain nitrates. And nitrates interact with the protein, especially when they're heated, and they create what are called nitrosamines that are carcinogenic. And so these nitrates, the preservatives that are put into them, oftentimes many of the deli meats have added colors that might be potentially carcinogenic. And of course, our FDA, in all of their wisdom, will say things as, it's at a safe level. It's, safe for, what's the particular acronym? But it's like, basically, they're talking about a level safe for human consumption. But that doesn't mean that it's not bad for you. It just means that, well, if you only have a small little bit, it's not going to kill you. But when you start adding all of that up, it's going to be something that, can lead to a potential carcinogen. And so all of that tends to promote not only a risk for cancer, but it also can be linked to gut and systemic inflammation.
Wow. Crazy. Man, yeah, I just feel like I don't know. I don't want to talk too bad about the FDA. They might be listening to this podcast, but then if they're listening, great. Maybe we can make some changes. But some of the stuff that gets approved it's mind blowing to me. Like I just found out on shredded cheese, that little white powder to prevent it from clumping, that actually comes from wood chips, like wood shavings and stuff like that. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even know we could digest that. So that
Well,
just
we probably can. It's probably a fiber, but yeah, it might not be horrible, but it's, you have to look closely at what are you eating, and some of the stuff may be harmless and some of the stuff may be pretty harmful.
Mhm.
But, we want to look at the foods that we're eating. Are we eating a lot of ultra-processed foods? And we've talked about ultra-processed, that it's not necessarily bad. You look at like whey protein is something that is considered ultra-processed. But again, if it has high refined carbs, a lot of unhealthy fats in it, there's a lot of additives that you can't pronounce. A lot of processed foods are very low in fiber, and they're designed to be kind of addictive, so that you're eating more of it, which can lead to increased obesity. It is not what our body is naturally designed to be eating, and so it can disrupt our gut health, which leads to all other kind of issues, including spikes in inflammatory markers. If we're eating a lot of sugary stuff, that sugar drives insulin, creates a lot of oxidative stress, and again, fuels inflammatory paths. If we're eating whole grains, we want to avoid the high processed grains. Try, if you have to eat things like breads and, prepared, more refined grains, you're not looking at something that has basically been stripped of all of its nutrients, and then those nutrients being put back in.
Yeah.
We want to eat, healthier whole foods. And in many cases, if you can get, really fresher bakery bread as opposed to store-bought processed bread, you're going to be much better off. So there's a lot of things that we can avoid eating.
Rice is a good example of this. Like if you flip open, like if you're looking at the bags of rice and you're like, what kind of rice do I want? If it just says like jasmine rice, you're good. If that's all it has, just whatever the rice you're buying, it says that. But if it says like ultra processed or enriched rice, that's usually where the issue comes in, is it not?
Yeah. So we just avoid things that say enriched or processed. And it doesn't often tell us that it's processed, but if the more ingredients that you see on something that should not have ingredients, the more processed it is.
Right.
So,
and we talked about it, just an easy pro hack of just staying on the outside aisles of the grocery store. Stay away from the chips and the crackers and obviously fast food. But what about in that frozen section? What about frozen meats?
Well, again, you want to look at the ingredients. There's nothing wrong with freezing, because freezing is a natural preservative. You freeze berries, and particularly most vegetables and things that are frozen are actually going to be probably fresher than the stuff in the fresh produce, because as soon as they're picked, they're taken and they're flash frozen, packaged, and then shipped off, and so they're going to maintain their nutrient composition for a much longer period of time when they're frozen, as long as you keep them frozen, than something that is sitting kind of decaying in your refrigerator that you're not eating. And so you probably, expense-wise, save a lot of money eating more frozen fruits and vegetables, because you're not throwing things away because they decompose. They might be a little bit fresher from the start because, again, they're flash frozen, as opposed to spending time on a truck traveling to you and either ripening on the truck or decomposing on the truck. But you want to look at, is there anything added to that particular frozen food that is potentially harmful to me or potentially inflammatory? And so if it's just berries, then you're okay. But if it's berries plus about 6 different chemicals or things like that, you want to put that back on the shelf and look at the label of the next product.
Right. And obviously, not just eating your calories, but drinking it as well would be a very that's not good. That's going to cause inflammation. Sodas, sweet teas, energy drinks is a really bad one. What's your thought on people that are like, well, you know what? I'm eating healthy. Maybe why can't I just treat myself to a beverage every now and then?
Well, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. It's really how much of a habit has it become? How frequent are you doing? You don't need perfection. I think a lot of us were kind of an all or nothing mentality where, we're either eating a horribly junk food ridden diet or we're stressing out over eating all natural. And, chronic inflammation comes from patterns, not just single meals. So if you have an occasional pop or soda, it's not going to be a big deal. We don't want to do that more habitually. We want to think more in terms of the direction. Again, we're focusing in on that transformational aging. How are we changing our diet to be more healthy, to be more, giving more vitality to our lives? And so if you think the more I'm eating whole foods, so shifting, the more whole foods I'm putting into my diet, the less inflammation I'm going to get. The more processed foods that I'm eating, the more inflammation I'm getting. And so if we are replacing those processed foods with more whole foods, the more we replace, the more we're driving inflammation down as opposed to up. So think of it as that seesaw. We don't want to have to throw a bunch of things at, healing inflammation because we're eating a highly inflammatory diet. And if we eat a highly anti-inflammatory diet, we can on occasion have things that might be a little bit more pro-inflammatory and not worry about it. We had this discussion in my class last week as we talked about carcinogens. And as I'm going through all these things that are carcinogens, guys, I'm going to be destroying your lives here by telling you all these things that you shouldn't be eating. But, if it's, you're going to have, there's nothing wrong with going to a ballpark once in a while and having a ballpark Frank.
Right.
I like those. Am I going to eat them every day? No. But, the 1 or 2 times I might a year have, a hot dog, it's not going to kill me, and on average, we should be eating more anti-inflammatory than we are eating pro-inflammatory. And if we do that, then we're going to be aging well. We'll take a quick pause to acknowledge the affiliate brands that help make this podcast possible. These aren't sponsors, and no one pays for placement. But when you use our affiliate links, it supports the mission of the Aging Well podcast. One partner I've chosen after careful vetting is Berkeley Life, known for their nitric oxide support products. I value their commitment to quality, testing, and education around vascular wellness, and I use their products myself. If you'd like to support the show and explore Berkeley Life for your own health journey, you'll find a link in the episode description.
And you kind of answered my next question, but I was going to say, well, we just talked about sugary drinks. What about the people that want to make the decision of, the zero sugar or the diet drinks where it's like an artificial sweetener into it? But you kind of answered my question with the fact that, well, that's also inflammatory. That's going to cause inflammation as well. So,
but it's a baby step. If you're eating a lot of you're drinking a lot of sugared pop, you're not going to be able to just immediately shift from drinking, 3 diet Pepsis a day to be drinking, filtered mineral water, everything you drink. And so if you make that shift, okay, I'm going to cut the calories by shifting from the sugary drink to the diet drink, and then start, drinking less diet pop and drinking more, just clean water. It's going to be baby steps, and it's going to take you toward aging well.
Here's a controversial thing, and I know we've had other episodes on this, but what about industrial seed oils? Obviously, an excess amount would be bad, but I'm talking about soybean, corn, cottonseed, canola, sunflower oils. Like what? Come on, let's talk about this.
Well, it's a tough thing to sell either way. I think, we have become so polarized in some of these different arguments, and the whole seed oil thing has actually become almost more politicized than anything. It's like, if you're a Republican, you're totally opposed to drinking or eating, any kind of industrial oil. And if you're a Democrat, then, and I'm saying this somewhat in jest, but you're a Democrat, then you're all for seed oils and not eating beef tallow and whatnot. If RFK says that I should be eating beef tallow, then I'm going to do the exact opposite. And it's not that simple. It's not so black and white when it comes to industrial oils. And just using the label industrial oil paints it as a little bit more of an evil. Certainly we should be eating less processed oils. And your industrial oils, as we want to call them, are generally highly processed. And there may be chemicals involved in that processing that are harmful to us, that are going to be pro-inflammatory. So we want to avoid them as much as possible. But in some situations, it's not that bad on rare occasions, and I think the better argument is how much oils are we using in our diet, period. We don't want to be just consuming a lot of oils. Fats are a little bit different than oils. But if you're eating fried food, first of all, some oils are just not as good for frying. Avocado oil, olive oil, those are not foods that have a high flash point that make them good for frying things. But the question isn't, okay, well, what oil should I be doing to frying? Well, why am I frying in the first place? We're adding unnecessary fat in that frying process. So just don't fry food. And then you're not looking at, what oil do I need to add or not add? And, you're eating French fries fried in beef tallow, you're still eating fried freaking food, right? So just avoid the general oils in particular. Be getting the fats that our body needs through whole foods. I'm not going to cook in peanut oil, but eating peanuts is going to be more healthy for me. Or, eating a whole olive is better than eating, a tablespoon of olive oil.
Right.
And so, if I'm eating meat, I'm going to be getting meat, beef fat. That's better than eating beef tallow. So I think we got to get away from this whole back and forth over, good oil, bad oil, and just eat less processed oils and be done with it, right? And try and eat oils and foods that are as close to their whole food as possible. And then we're going to avoid it.
But if we are going to eat oils or fats, don't we, or we're going to cook with them, don't we want to be aware of the thermal point with them, like the thermal threshold? Because so for olive oil, for example, if we cook it at too high of a temperature, it changes the chemical compound, which can cause inflammation, versus, say, like beef tallow or ghee, which has a higher thermal point, which doesn't necessarily cause. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about olive oil. There's plenty of benefits of specifically like extra virgin olive oil. You add it to your salad, or it's awesome. I cook with it. I use olive oil all the time. I just isn't there something regarding the thermal threshold, or is that completely irrelevant?
Well, that's what I was just talking about. It's not irrelevant, but it is irrelevant if we just avoid cooking in oils in the first place. If we're eating more whole raw foods, which we should be doing, then it's not an issue. But, if you're going to be frying stuff, that frying alone, whatever oil you're cooking it in, is having a processing effect on that food that's going to diminish the quality of the food that you're eating. And so the more we're eating whole raw food, oil's not an issue, right? And, if I'm talking about having oil in my, many of the foods that we eat, you look at vegetable oil, where is that oil coming from? It's coming from vegetables. So if you're eating a whole vegetable, you're going to get some level of fat from those vegetables, not a lot, but do we need that much more fat? You're much, much healthier eating just whole fruits and vegetables rather than trying to extract the oils that might come in them. Get some oil from eating whole nuts rather than, squeezing the oil out of the fat, out of the nut and, using that to cook with. And so I think, we have overcomplicated this stuff. And if it's just get more to the whole natural food, then the whole oil argument goes away.
Right. Hey, one thing that you mentioned on an earlier podcast that we had recorded is when we were talking about our 6 pillars, and one of the pillars is not smoking. You completely said this beautiful thing where not smoking isn't just about not smoking. It's about not doing things that are going to slowly be killing you, essentially. It's about having harm you. And it's on the subject of inflammation and carcinogens and harming you and stuff like that. What about alcohol consumption, especially when it comes to daily or binge drinking alcohol?
Daily and binge drinking are still kind of two sides of a coin. Daily, how much you drinking on a daily basis? There's a fair amount of evidence that, if you could abstain 100% from drinking alcohol, it's going to have the greater health benefits for you. We've been back and forth in the literature over recent years in terms of there being some level of health benefits in certain alcoholic beverages in small dosages, like having a glass of wine a day. Most of those are not going to be horribly harmful for you. So there's a bit of a balance that we need to have in there. Now, when you talk binge drinking generally is defined as, I think it's like, more than 3 or 6 drinks in, a short period of time. So if you're coming home from work and you're downing a 6-pack or more of beer, that's going to be unhealthy for you. You're drinking a whole bottle of wine in a day, that's harmful for you. You're having a glass of wine, you're having a beer, it's probably a little less harmful for you. But drinking alcohol does tend to damage the gut lining. It can increase inflammation. It certainly puts stress on the liver. And if the liver is stressed, then the liver can't do its detoxification. And that's going to put a bit more inflammation into the system. And so we really have to consider, why are we drinking? How much are we drinking? When are we drinking? And if we cannot drink at all, then that's great, and we shouldn't, judge people or shame people who do choose to drink some. We don't want to drink excessively. So if we can limit maybe our drinks to 1 day a week, might be a better approach. If we're going to drink daily, probably no more than a drink a day. That drink should be consumed earlier in the day rather than late at night. So if you're downing a drink to help put you to sleep at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, that's actually going to disrupt your sleep patterns more than it's going to benefit you. You might think you're sleeping, but your quality of sleep is going to be disrupted. So if you're going to have a daily drink, probably late afternoon, very early evening, couple of to 3 hours before you're going to bed is going to be the more ideal time to do so. And, again, you want to look at the quality of what you're drinking as well, and it should be done more for, the social benefit of the drinking. Sitting down drinking alone is not healthy. Sitting down with another individual or a group of individuals and, socializing together over a drink is not going to be that horribly harmful. So it's like, really, when we're talking about pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, we're really talking about excess alcohol. And what is excess has probably not been as fully ironed out in terms of the science and the literature for it. But we're somewhere between no drinking and very little drinking as being the healthy side, and excess being more than a couple drinks per day, maybe more than a couple drinks per week. But, we want to really try and limit our alcohol. And so, if you're drinking daily, and, maybe the first step is to drink half as much as you are drinking on a daily basis, and then start cutting out days and start, as we are able, to pare down the amount of alcohol consumption that we are having without overly sweating the details, because we're going to get in situations where, it becomes more awkward. You're, at a holiday party or something like that, and everybody is, partaking, and, you're not consuming at all, and you look, you're feeling awkward, and that's causing you stress. That's probably less healthy than, okay, it's okay. Go ahead, have a drink. Don't drink in excess. Does that make sense? And does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, you hit all the points of, sleep hygiene and the social aspects, and try not to do it excess. So yeah, that definitely answered my question. Me, on just personal note, I've shared, I'm like 3.5 years no drinking, and I feel great. I don't feel swollen. I remember when I did drink, like my joints would just get really tight, and since not drinking, that has completely gone away. Again, not shaming anyone. I do miss the social aspect. I do miss pairing certain foods with either a beer or a wine. But for me, it just wasn't. It's just not worth it. And I made that decision not to drink, and it's been a wonderful decision. And if anyone else wants to make that decision, I encourage you to do so, but I'm not shaming you if you don't. So yeah, that's just my personal 2 cents.
And I drink on occasion. I mean, I've never drank, well, I can't say I never drank excessively. I did go to West Virginia University when it was the number one party school in the country, to the point it was labeled as professional. But, overall, have never really drank excessively. And, when I drink now, it's purposeful. It's, I want to enjoy the taste of it. And, I'm not drinking, if I'm going to have a beer, it's not going to be a crap beer. It's not going to be something that is mass produced. It's something that has some level of flavor to it. But, it's going to be in a more social setting. It's like date night with my wife, maybe go out on occasion, or occasionally when we do our 15-minute check-ins in the late afternoon after work, we might sit down and have a glass of wine or something, or I might occasionally have a glass of whiskey, just to enjoy the taste of it. And if I could find that with no alcohol in it, it's probably going to be much more likely to drink that than to be drinking what has the alcohol in it. But it's just, it's how are you using it? Why are you using it? And, another big question is, do you have to? If you feel that you actually have to be drinking that, then it could be a problem that you need to address.
That's very well said. Um, what about highly processed dairy? I mean, the obvious would be sweetened yogurt, ice cream, flavored milk. These can all trigger inflammation in those sensitive to lactose and casein. But what about the milk, like Fairer Life or Fairview milk, where it's like lactose free milk? I feel like that's processed. And I also feel like some of their products are like they've increased the protein level. And I feel like that's processed itself. Is that causing inflammation if people see that and they're wanting to make a healthier choice?
Well, I mean, again, it's really how it affects some people. Some people are going to have different tolerances to dairy. A lot of it depends on what we're doing to dairy. I think a lot of American dairy is far more processed and corrupted in ways that cause us health issues that dairy in other countries may not be quite as bad. I think we just want to kind of look on the label. What's being done to the dairy that we're consuming? I think overall limit dairy, particularly like milk and some of those types of things that we're drinking. Particularly you start looking at flavored anything, then there's things being added to it. Yogurts are not that bad. I mean, I think there's a lot of health benefits, particularly in like your Greek yogurts and your skyr. So when you're eating those, try and avoid the sweetened or flavored ones, because you look at the label, you look at skyr, it's basically skim milk and the culture that creates the yogurt, nothing else. But then you look at the same brand and it has flavor to it. Now they add like 4 to 5 chemicals to that makes it even worse. Ice cream, again, I'm not going to blame anybody for an occasional ice cream, but if I'm eating ice cream, I want it to be good ice cream. I don't want to eat just cheap, flavorless ice cream. And kind of same with flavored milk. There's some good times when chocolate milk tastes really, really good. Other times when, it's just like, I'm drinking Yoo-hoo. And so you really have to understand how it responds to your own body. And if you're noting that, you feel a bit more bloated, you're feeling, digestive issues, you're feeling signs of inflammation from consuming dairy, then don't consume dairy. And then overall, try and consume less dairy. And, if you're again eating it, I would say, your better approach to getting some of your dairy would be in yogurts and those types of foods. And, I don't think the jury is out yet in terms of skim milk versus whole milk in terms of the whole fat benefits. And we've talked in the past that there's a certain amount of evidence that older adults should be eating whole fat dairy because of just some of the neurological benefits that they get from the added fat. And so I think, when we look at dairy, we want to look at the degree of processing as the primary decision as to whether or not dairy is going to be pro or anti-inflammatory for us.
Right. So basically, I think the take home that you're saying is you don't need perfection.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've talked about that already, that, again, it's think in terms of direction. Eat more whole food, eat less processed food.
Yeah. So what's one action our viewers and listeners can take after this episode?
Well, again, I would emphasize, remember that this is an addition and subtraction equation. Add before you subtract. Primary thing is start adding one anti-inflammatory food daily, berries at breakfast, maybe greens at lunch, adding some fish or flaxseed at dinner, use turmeric in your cooking. And over time, those inflammatory foods will begin to naturally lose some of their power. And at the same time, we can start substituting healthy whole foods for unhealthy processed foods. It's all baby steps.
Baby step, something about Bob.
Yeah.
Well, chronic inflammation isn't loud, it's quiet, slow, and destructive. But the solution doesn't have to be complicated. Every meal is a chance to either fuel disease or feed healing. And that's a choice. 3 times a day is one of the most powerful tools we have for aging well.
Aging well. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.